Fellows and Dan Borges will be joining me, and we'll all spend about 20 minutes presenting on a different topic related to bees and pollinators. I will introduce each speaker before they present, and then at the end, we'll all come together. If you have questions throughout the program, please share and comment on the Facebook stream, and I will do my best to moderate at the end. So now for our first speaker. Kiera Newman is a researcher at the University of Guelph and a PhD candidate. She has studied monarch butterflies, diamondback moths, and wild and honeybees. Conservation is her passion, and she spends her time unraveling the mystery of how monarchs and other pollinators share milkweed resources. She is also interested in how pollinators use medicine and flower nectar to treat their diseases. Please welcome Kiera as she presents on pollination sensation.
Thanks, Caitlin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kiera Newman, and yes, I'm a researcher at the University of Guelph. Pollination is my specialty, and there's just so much to talk about that I'll have to be very specific in just picking out some of the highlights that I'd like to share with you about the insights that I have and the research that I've been doing over the past several years. So you can see on my first slide here, I have 3 pollinators. You probably recognize the bumblebee there in the sedum flowers. Bumblebees are about honeybee size or a little bit larger. The queens are quite a bit larger, but they're definitely fuzzier. So you've probably seen those out and about. The middle one, the middle picture is an Augichlora, and you may or may not have seen these bees flying around, and you may have even thought that they were flies because you've probably seen some brightly colored green flies, but these bees are definitely bees. If you take another look, you'll be able to possibly see the difference, and they're beautiful. They're just like little gems out there on the flowers. And on the right, of course, we have a monarch butterfly, which I've done research with in the past, and most of us know some of the story behind the monarch. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that in the context of my research as we go through the slides. So I'd like to start by talking about why pollination is important. Pollination is important because plants can't move. So how does a plant find a partner? Well, it needs to get something to help it spread its pollen. Now, this can be as easy as using wind or water or even gravity to help pollen move from one plant to another, or even from one flower to another on the same plant, and sometimes even within the same flower. That self-pollination can happen as well. But in most cases, the plant is going to use an animal pollinator to help it get its pollen from one place to another. And there's such a diversity in the pollinators that plants can use for this purpose. They vary from arthropods to birds, reptiles, snails, slugs, a little bit of a slower process, bats and other mammals, even lemurs and mice. So lots of different variety there in the animal pollinators that plants can use. Plants generally attract these pollinators with nectar. Nectar is the reward that an animal pollinator would get for visiting a flower and then moving to another flower for more nectar, and in the process, dropping off some of the pollen that it has picked up at that first flower. Sorry, get used to the direction here with this. But plants don't give their nectar away for free. Nectar is an expensive item for a plant to produce. It costs energy to produce it. So they're going to be very specific about who they present that nectar to and who they're trying to attract with it. They really are expecting pollen delivery in exchange for this nectar. So they want to be really specific about who they're attracting so that that pollinator is really efficient at delivering their exact pollen to another flower of the same species. And so flowers have evolved these pollination syndromes, or groups of plant traits, in order to attract specific pollinators. And some of these plant traits include things like scent, the smell of a flower. And of course, we know that because almost every flower that we smell, every different flower has a different smell, and that's because it has a slightly different chemical composition in order to attract possibly a different pollinator. Some pollinators are generalists and they'll go to any smell at all, but sometimes a plant is trying to attract specific type of pollinator with a specific type of smell. And we like those smells that are attractive to us, the sweet smelling floral smells. But there are pollinators out there that want the opposite. They want something that smells foul or stinky or decaying. Flies and beetles, for example, often are attracted more to um, decaying meat smelling nectar. And so that's what a plant would produce if it's trying to attract that type of pollinator. In terms of color and pattern, bees can't see in red. They do see in the ultraviolet spectrum, but they don't see red colors. So if a flower is trying to attract a bee, it wouldn't necessarily invest energy in producing a red flower. Now, you might see bees that are going to red flowers, but that's because they're being attracted to that flower by something else in addition to that red color, which could be the smell. It could be an ultraviolet pattern on that flower, which I've shown in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen here. This is what a flower would look like under ultraviolet light, but that pattern might not be able to be seen under regular light, and yet bees can see that. On the right here, I've shown a hummingbird because it really shows how the flower shape and size is directly related to the pollinator that it's trying to attract. So you can see that the bill or beak of that hummingbird is just the right length, that nectar, which is held right at the base of that flower by the stem, that hummingbird is going to have to get its bill all the way in there to get the nectar. And in the process, it'll get some pollen on its face. And then when the bird moves to another flower, that pollen is going to be dropped off and delivered in exchange for the nectar. Also, nectar quality or quantity and timing. If a plant is trying to attract a night flying moth or bat, it's not going to invest in nectar production during the day. It'll save that for the night in order to attract night flying animals. So that's a little bit about why plants are investing in certain types of traits or pollinator syndromes. And those pollinators that they're attracting are very diverse, as I mentioned. Here's just a few of the other important ones in our area. Beetles are important because they're so abundant. There are over 30,000 species in North America. So even if they're not the most efficient pollinators, they're just so abundant that they do quite a bit of pollination services for us. Wasps are also abundant. They feed on nectar as adults, not as larvae. They would feed on insects and other animal products, but as adults, they visit flowers for the nectar. Flies also very abundant. Some also mimic bees. They're capitalizing on the fact that some animals know that bees sting, so if they look like a bee, they might not get eaten. And it's interesting to note that some flies are actually produced commercially because they're such great pollinators for crops such as carrots. So just like we use honeybees for certain crop pollination, some farms would commercialize fly pollination and bring those in abundance in order to pollinate some of their crops. Moths are also very abundant, 10,000 species in North America. Many of those have very specialized relationships with the flowers that they pollinate. And so it's important for us to understand those and make sure that we're conserving the pollinators and the plants that they rely on. And yet bees are the best pollinators. They need both pollen and nectar for food, as opposed to those other ones that I talked about that are really just after the nectar. Bees need to collect pollen because they need to provision their nests with pollen. That's where they lay their eggs and where the larvae are being raised on that pollen. So it's just as important for bees to be collecting the pollen as the nectar, and then they can drop off even more as they move to another flower. I've shown a picture of a close-up of some pollen grains on the left because I think it's just so fascinating that every pollen grain, every species of plant has a different type of pollen grain too, and how those stick to a bee is different for each species of flower as well. The hairy bodies of bees are excellent at attracting this pollen and helping them to move it from plant to plant. And bees do something called flower constancy, where if you have a field that has daisies and buttercups, those bees are going to go out and visit as many of the same type of flower as they can before they return to their hive or nest, instead of going back and forth between the buttercups and the daisies. And in this way, there's a higher likelihood that the right species of flower is going to get the right pollen. So that's important too, that a reason why bees are so good at that. Just to note that honeybees are part of the group that I'm talking about, but honeybees are not native to North America. The ones we have here are basically from Europe or Asia. They were brought to North America for honey and pollination services, and they're really important in our crop pollination, but they are susceptible to a number of diseases. They're also not as efficient as most native bees are at pollination. However, they are more numerous and easier to transport. So that makes them really great for crop pollination, but I'm emphasizing the fact that we have a lot of native bees in our area, and those are the ones that we also really need to learn about and understand. In fact, there are over 20,000 species of native bees in the world. And you can see from this picture, they come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them are very hairy, like those bumblebees. Some of them hardly have any hair on them at all. And in fact, there's a whole group of parasitic bees that their strategy is, instead of wasting time collecting pollen and provisioning their own nests, which they would need to be hairy for, they lay their eggs in other bees' nests. And in that way, they get a different bee to raise their offspring. They don't have to invest time or energy in that. And so they don't really need to worry about collecting pollen on hairy bodies. So often when we see bees that don't have a lot of hair, we're looking at a parasitic bee or a male bee, which also doesn't need to collect pollen in order to provision nests. That's not part of its job. So yeah, there are lots of native bees out there, and we classify these bees in different ways. One way that we classify these bees, because we really do need to group them in order to understand them better, is based on their genetics, their phylogenetics. And here in Ontario, we have 6 families of bees. We have the Andrenidae, which are the minor bees, Apidae, which is that family that includes honeybees, but also bumblebees, carpenter bees, and squash bees, the Coletidae, the cellophane and masked bees, the Halictidae, which are sweat and pearly banded bees, Megachilidae, or leaf cutter, orchard and mason bees. And then we have another group, the Meletidae, that are very rare, but they are here, so we include them in the list as well. So this is one way that we classify bees. There are also some other ways that we can group bees based on their similarities, and one is how specialized they are. So I mentioned with moths that they often have these specialized relationships with the plant that they need for nectar for moths. And bees there are a lot of specialist bees as well that require a very specific species or a few species of plants. And that's where, in terms of conservation, we really need to understand the ecology behind that so that we're conserving those bees by conserving their plants. One example is the squash bee, which is found all over North America, even though it's a specialist on plants in the Cucurbitaceae family. Luckily, humans love those plants for vegetables. So we've done a great job of spreading this family all over North America. So even though it's a specialist, the squash bee probably isn't in any danger of becoming extinct because we have lots of its food source. The only pollen source of the sunflower bee, however, is the sunflower itself. So this bee is an extreme specialist on sunflower. If we lost our sunflowers of that specific species, Diodacea innovata, we would lose our sunflower bee as well. And then we have a whole group of bees that are generalists that don't require just one species. They can collect pollen and nectar from a whole group of flowers, but that doesn't necessarily keep them safe. The rusty-patched bumblebee, Bombus affinis, is a generalist. However, it is virtually non-existent in Ontario anymore. It was very prevalent here a few decades ago. And even though it's a generalist, it's just not found here anymore. So there's some other reasons behind its local extinction that we're still trying to figure out. And finally, we can classify them based on their sociality. So bees can be either social, we call it eusocial, or they can be solitary and really just keep to themselves and their small family unit. In terms of social bees, honeybees and bumblebees come to mind. They exhibit task specialization. So some of them are nurse bees, some of them are workers, some of them defend the nest. But some other wild bees are also social. They live in groups, and there's really a scale. It's not just one or the other. There's a whole scale of eusociality. Nesting type is also a way that we classify bees. And it also links to their sociality because most ground nesters are actually solitary. It's interesting here that 70% of bees, of those 20,000 species of wild bees, nest underground. So, from a conservation perspective, it's really important that we know how valuable that habitat is for them. They can't nest in places that are highly mulched or have landscape fabric over them or have a lawn there that keeps them from nesting. We need to provide them with some habitat where they can make these ground nests. And you can see that picture up to the top left there of those nests that they make into the ground like that. We need to leave some bare ground for them and make sure that those 70% of bees have access to that. 30% of them nest above ground, and I've put the bumblebee nest there to the right. In addition to that, that picture underneath there is a species of bee that nests within a stem. So it's important also for those 30% of bees that nest above ground for them to have stems and places that they can nest in, and not for us to go and clean up our yards to the point where we've cleared away all that old plant material from the previous year, which might have bee nests in it. So who cares about all of this? Who cares about those 20,000 species of bees and all those other pollinators? Well, from an economic standpoint, it's very important. We have hundreds of billions of dollars worth of our economy that is based on the fact that the pollination happens. So that's the value of pollination to our global agriculture. And if we don't have pollinators and bees, we don't have the food that goes along with that industry, and we don't have the money that flows through the economies that keeps those economies going as well. It's also necessary for life in general. So this wheel on the right is an ecosystem services wheel. It shows all the things that nature does for us for free. It provides us with fish and wood. It controls flooding. It purifies our water, stores our carbon. And virtually all of these services are in one way or another related to pollination. We can't store carbon in our trees and plants if we don't have pollination services that keep those trees growing and new trees forming. So pollination is important for not just our economy and our agriculture, but really for all of those ecosystem services that we enjoy. Pollinators are in decline. I'm not going to talk about this in too much detail because I imagine that probably Dan Borges will talk about this a little bit more in relation to honeybees, which is really the same factors that are also contributing to wild bee declines. But I did want to mention a few of them. Relating to wild bee declines, that loss of food and nesting resources is critical. And I'll show you that I've mentioned here that especially given their small ranges, their ability to only fly a certain distance from their nest. I'll show you a picture in just a minute. Pesticide use is contributing to bee declines. Disease, the pathogen spillover on flowers, and this is happening in honeybees and bumblebees, commercialized bees, as well as that spread is spreading into wild bee communities as well. Honeybees, which are so valuable for crops, are in fact so numerous that they could be out competing wild bees as well. So we need to look at that. And climate change and the phenology, the timing of bees emerging when their plant sources emerge is also a factor that's contributing to their decline. So here's a picture of how far bees can fly. And we talked about those solitary bees, that there's so many species of them, and yet some of them have really small ranges and can only fly between 250 and 1,000 meters from their nest site. So it's important that we're giving them the ground habitat and the above ground habitat and the floral resources, the pollen and the nectar that they need within a small space, because they can only fly a certain distance. And when they emerge, they might only be in the adult stage for a few weeks of their life. So it's also important that we time our plantings, if we're planting gardens for them, such that there's plants of flowers available for them, regardless of which 2-week period throughout the season they are looking for food and for provisions for their nests. Bumblebees can fly a little bit further. Honeybees have a 6-kilometer range from their nests. So in terms of floral resources and finding food, honeybees and bumblebees are a little bit better off than those solitary bees. My research looks at how monarch conservation practices, particularly the planting of milkweed, affects wild and honeybees. And I'm looking at whether milkweed is good or bad for bees. And it's an open question. I'm still doing my research, but milkweed is such a interesting plant because although it provides abundant nectar, it doesn't provide any usable pollen. So all of that activity that I talked about where female wild bees and honeybees are visiting flowers for their pollen and then provisioning their nests, they can't get that from milkweed, but they can get a lot of nectar. There's also the situation where the nectar, the pollen is packaged in these little maple key like configurations. And that picture on the left shows a honeybee actually stuck in that pollen. It's called pollinia. So that could be a way that bees are suffering, in fact, from not having or from visiting milkweed flowers. One of the big questions that I'm looking at is whether milkweed provides medicine to treat some of those really bad diseases that honeybees and wild bees are experiencing, or whether because it's such a popular plant for bees to land on, it's actually contributing to pathogen spillover from honeybees and bumblebees into wild bee communities. So there's lots here that could be going on, and milkweed could be a good thing or a bad thing. I do have some preliminary data that shows that honeybees love milkweed. In fact, where they can find milkweed, they are more likely found on that than nearby wildflowers. Wild bees don't like honeybees. And while this statement might not be very scientific, what it's saying is that in areas where there are honeybees, the wild bees are less likely to be abundant and diverse. So we need to look at what's causing that lower abundance and diversity near honeybee hives for wild bees. Overall, my research is showing that on milkweed, we do have a lot of diversity. Over 22 genera and 88 species of wild bees have been found on milkweed. Those wild bees are more diverse and abundant on wildflowers near the milkweed, though, instead of right on the milkweed. And the honeybee presence results in fewer wild bees in an area. I'm still testing whether milkweed nectar is medicinal, but it's definitely abundant. It's a good source of calories for all of those bees. And as a side note, old milkweed stems provide excellent homes for a wide diversity of animals: slugs, worms, ants, beetles, centipedes, all kinds of other animal life has called milkweed stems their homes. So if you do have milkweed growing on your property or nearby, leave those old stems for other animals to enjoy, because milkweed feeds more than just monarchs. It's a whole community of bees and monarchs and other insects and animals that you'll find there as well. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'll pass the baton back to Caitlin, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiera. That was really wonderful and informative. Now I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Kim Fellows worked for 7 years as the Pollination Canada Outreach Coordinator at Seeds of Diversity Canada. Kim's related background includes a Bachelor of Science honors and Masters of Science in Biology from Queen's University at Kingston, Ontario. Currently, Kim is active in her bee city of Kitchener. Now, Kim's portion of her presentation was pre-recorded. However, we're happy to have Kim listening in, and she will also be available for questions at the end. So I'll encourage you, if you do have any questions, please share them in the Facebook comments, and we'll get to them after all our presenters have spoken. So please welcome Kim as she takes us through the world of pollinators. What's the buzz?
Thank you, Caitlin, for that introduction. It's an honor to be here with my fellow panelists, and thanks to those of you who are tuning in. I applaud the museum for hosting this important exhibition. It certainly couldn't be more timely. So this evening, in addition to explaining how bees sounded an alarm, I'm going to introduce you to some different kinds of bees and show you how you can help them thrive. And I'm going to start us off with a very basic definition. I do apologize for this slide. It is a bit glitchy. So let's define pollination. As you may know, plants have male and female parts located in their flowers. I've enlarged those parts here and here. So these blue granules that you see spilling out here are pollen grains, which are the male genetic material of a plant. And pollination is all about how these pollen grains get to the female part of the plant. So pollination is the first necessary step in plant reproduction. Without it, the plant can't produce seed, nor will it develop into food if it's a crop plant. Since plants are rooted and they can't chase each other around in order to accomplish pollination, how does the pollen get transferred? Well, we have physical forces such as wind and water that move pollen. So some of the staple grasses such as barley, wheat, oats, rye, rice, corn, these are types of plants that only need the wind to accomplish pollination. Mother Nature also came up with an interesting partnership to accomplish pollination using animals. Animals that pollinate are called pollinators, and they include birds and bats, butterflies and moths, bees, flies, some which mimic bees. So this one we might say is a fly wearing a bee costume. Beetles also do some pollinating, and so do wasps. But in North America, it is bees who perform over 70%, or at least 70% of the pollination services. And there are a couple of reasons that bees are the most efficient insect pollinator. Here we're looking at a close-up view of a bee's head. Here is her eye. Here are the bases of her antenna. And you can see lots and lots of yellow pollen grains. And so the first reason that their bees are so good at pollinating is that they are usually fuzzy or hairy. They have usually fuzzy or hairy bodies that are electrostatically charged, very good at attracting and carrying around small particles like pollen. Secondly, bees are the only pollinator that rely only on flowers for all their nutritional needs. So bees are simply feeding from blossoms. They are collecting pollen and they're drinking nectar. Nectar is their carbohydrate source, pollen is their protein source. Not all flowers offer nectar, but if they do, they're usually located down here in the flower. At any rate, what you can note is that the flower is designed in such a way that the bee is brushing up against the flower parts and thus depositing pollen where the flower wants it to go. In contrast, the other pollinators that I mentioned have more diverse diets and are not just feeding on the products of flowers. So for example, wasps are carnivorous and they'll feed on other insects, including so-called garden pests. But they'll also seek out sugar and meat sources from human food too. And this explains why it's likely wasps hanging out at your picnics and not bees, unless of course you're snacking on pollen and nectar. This is a lovely honeybee collecting pollen from a New England aster. Note her very large pollen loads on her legs here. She's been busy. So human cultures have been fascinated and charmed by the honeybee for a very long time. We have a long history of association, going back at least 8,000 years, as gleaned from cave paintings, ancient cave paintings that show people robbing a beehive for its honey. And we were keeping artificial hives for honeybees by 3000 BC. Here in North America, honeybees arrived for about 400 years ago in Jamestown, Virginia, with the colonists as an agricultural tool. Honeybees are considered highly social insects as they work together for a common goal. They raise their young together. So in their portable man-made hive boxes, honeybees can seemingly be put anywhere that a plant or a crop needs pollinating. However, if we examine their ecology or their behavior in nature, we discover that honeybees usually, this is on average, aren't effective collectors of food, or what we call foragers at temperatures less than 12 degrees Celsius, or in windy conditions, or rain or sleet. And that's important to keep in mind for plants that need pollination early in the spring, such as tree fruits. In the world, there are at least 20,000 species of bees, and about 4,000 in North America. Canada hosts over 850 of those bees. We're talking about mason bees, carpenter bees, sweat bees, leaf cutting bees, bumblebees, miner bees, squash bees, to name just a few. And they are designed and adapted for different flowers. So some bees have long tongues, some bees have short tongues, and that affects the kind of flower that they can access. They have different pollen preferences. They have different foraging temperatures, or temperatures at which they collect food. They have different distances that they are capable of flying, and they even have different times of day at which they forage. So these bees, native bees, are making important, often unnoticed contributions to pollination and ecosystem balance. Let's take a quick look at some of these. One group of native bees are bumblebees, and they work under cooler and damper conditions than honeybees. So they are often the first active bees in the spring, helping to pollinate willow and tree fruit. And they're generally the last ones active in the fall. And they can withstand the wetter, cooler conditions better than honeybees because they are able to shiver to create body warmth. Like honeybees, bumblebees raise their young together. So bumblebees are social on a much smaller scale than honeybees, though. Bumblebee colonies typically have 20 to 200 bees, while a honeybee hive averages 20 to 30,000 bees in the off-season, with a summer peak anywhere from 50 to 80,000 bees. And unlike honeybees that nest in man-made hives, bumblebees nest in small dry cavities such as abandoned mouse burrows, or under thick areas of grass, or in the jumble of old stone walls. Here's an example of a bumblebee nest. So they collect nectar and they store them in these pots that they're made out of wax, but it remains nectar versus true honey. So just honeybees and a couple other species not found in Canada make honey. So we looked at social bees like the honeybee and the bumblebee, which work together to raise their young. But in general, the rest of the native bees we find in Canada are what we call solitary instead of social. That means that a single solitary female does all the work on her own to produce the next generation. She's not working with her sisters like the bumblebees and the honeybees. So the squash bee is a solitary bee. You're looking at a squash bee, a female squash bee in a squash blossom. Squash bees only collect the pollen of cucurbit plants. So pumpkins, cucumbers, squash, zucchini, and melons are all part of the cucurbit family. Just like bumblebees, the squash bees don't have man-made hives to live in, and the squash bee makes its nest underground. In fact, 70% of our wild bees nest in the ground, and the other 30% are cavity dwellers, which means they nest in old pithy or soft stems of plants. Here we're looking at a cornfield that was a pumpkin field the year before, and all the orange flags that you see are marking nest entrances. And here on this inset, I have enlarged a nest entrance, and there's a female squash bee. What's interesting is that studies have discovered that honeybees don't really like squash pollen, and the squash bee's body is morphologically adapted to the squash or the cucurbit blossom. So what that means is that the squash bee has a larger, more robust body than the slender, elegant honeybee. And so the squash bee is better adapted to carrying squash pollen, which is spiny, which is probably why the honeybees don't like it. So again, knowing the ecology of these insects is really important for some decisions. At one time, people assumed that honeybees would just pollinate a field of pumpkin blossoms. But it's native bees like the squash bee or some bumblebees that are much more efficient pollinators of these plants. This schematic is showing you what a squash bee nest looks like underground. So the squash bee tunnels down to depths of about 45 centimeters, and she might have 3 to 5 tunnels coming off laterally. The female squash bee collects nectar and pollen, and she rolls them into a ball that is often called bee bread. So here you see the bee bread, the bee ball here, and she will lay an egg on top of that. And then she will seal the cell with soil, and she'll go on to the next one. So the egg will develop into a couple of further stages, and it will be nourished by the bee bread, and it will remain in the stage underground until the following summer. So these bees have very short lives. Here's another native bee that is solitary called a leaf-cutting bee. Leaf-cutting bees are also unusual in that they collect pollen on their abdomens instead of their legs like the honeybee does. And leaf-cutting bees are an example of cavity-dwelling bees that may tunnel nests in partially rotted wood hollow or pithy stems, reeds or canes such as elderberry, raspberry, and sumac. So here you see a leaf cutting bee who is clutching a part of a leaf that she has cut, as her leaf cutting name implies. And here's an example of where she has cut them from. So leaf cutting bees cut out leaves in a circular or semicircular shape and use them to line the cells of their nest. Here is a cross section to show you inside a typical nest of a cavity dweller. In this case, the bees used petals, very pretty petals. So this X-ray is showing you the individual cells containing developing bees. But I'd like to quickly explain what the leaf cutting bee does. Mama bee will enter the cell and start at the first cell. She will bring in her leaf piece and use it to line the cell to form a kind of baby bee blanket. And then again, she will make some bee bread. You see that over here. Here's the bee bread. And what looks like a grain of rice here is actually her egg that she has laid atop. So she will then go and seal the cell with more leaf pieces and go on and make the next, and so on. So you may find about 10 to 12 cells in a row in the nest of a leaf cutting bee. Okay, well, we have briefly surveyed 4 different kinds of bees. Let's examine the reasons why pollination is important. So, number 1 is it supports our wildlife. At least 80% of the world's flowering plants require a pollinator, and many of these plants provide food for wildlife, for textile fibers, for beneficial drugs, essences, for dyes, and of course for food. In general, pollinators are responsible for every 3rd bite of food or every 3rd sip that we enjoy. Pollinators also ensure that we have trees and plants that provide other ecosystem services such as oxygen generation, climate regulation, erosion control, nutrient cycling, and even recreational landscapes exist due to pollination. So it would be a great world without them, and they are having some troubles with population declines. Well, what are the reasons for these declines? There are actually multiple stressors that contribute to the decline in pollinator populations, but bees in particular, because they perform 70% of the pollination services. So honeybee population declines became apparent beginning around 2006 when beekeepers in North America started noticing higher than usual winter losses. And then spring losses were increasingly noted around corn planting times. So it turns out that the factors responsible for bee declines include habitat loss and degradation. So habitat are the places where they nest and they collect their food. So what we find is, what we find is that in urban spaces, habitat is being paved over. In agricultural spheres, what we find are monocultures, and that is where we are growing large swaths of just one crop. So for example, Ontario grows over 2 million acres of soybeans. It also grows over 2 million acres of corn for grain. The other agricultural feature that we see that leads to declines in bee populations is a loss of field margins or hedgerows. This was an area that used to contain a diversity of plants and therefore animals. But now most farmers will farm to the fence line. So this habitat loss obviously results in decreased nesting area and decreased forage or food. Chemicals kill bees, so pesticides, herbicides, insecticides. Pests and disease can take a toll on bees. When bees only have access to limited, low quality nutrition, and if they're affected by chemicals, this in turn suppresses their immunity, making them more susceptible to pests and disease. We also find that climatic shifts and invasive species can displace native populations of bees. So, for those who are wondering how to protect our pollinators, especially native bees, keep in mind that 3 basic needs must be met: adequate food, safe nest sites, and protection from pesticides. The most important thing that you can do for them is to plant for them. And since adequate bee food means the nectar and pollen from flowers, ideally you'll want to be showy and try to grow a mix of native perennials. And you can even think about trees, shrubs, wildflowers, native grasses, ground covers, and vines. Try to get a diversity of plants blooming so that there's always something in bloom from early spring to late autumn. That is ideal. And to support the diversity of our native pollinators, it's best to plant native species if you can. Because native pollinators and their plants have grown up together or co-evolved. So, and also native species are better adapted to our local growing conditions than non-native plants, and they require little or no water, especially once they're established. On the theme of native plants, an organization called Pollinator Partnership Canada has produced guides to help Canadians select ecologically regional native plants. Kitchener and Waterloo sit within the Manitoulin Lake Simcoe ecoregion. And these guides are available free online, and they're a great starting point. But I do encourage you to consult a variety of native plant lists to maximize diversity and avoid a kind of cookie cutter look. You can be hospitable. Try to avoid invasives and ornamentals that don't have any pollen and nectar. So a lot of hybrids or ornamentals don't offer nectar or pollen because it's been bred out of them. You can also set your mower height to allow for low blooming plants. So low plants that serve as ground cover, such as Dutch clover or dandelions, they're not native, but if they're in your yard and you haven't been able to replace them with native species, then allowing them to flower will feed pollinators, and theoretically, you can mow them before they seed. To help you avoid invasives, there are several online resources that help identify which plants may be aggressive or invasive. And for example, this Grow Me Instead guide is for Southern Ontario and suggests suitable alternatives for invasive plants. And this example, they're suggesting you grow wild strawberry instead of periwinkle. You can be giving. You can accept some insect activity. So now that you know that leaf-cutting bees make holes in leaves for use as baby bee blankets, you might tolerate this a little bit more. And you can allow, if you can allow pollinator larvae to overwinter on your plants, that's also really great, because removing stems from your garden in the autumn might be fatal for any bees that might be nesting in them. So you might want to think twice before putting pollinators at your curb and just allowing nature to happen. Being chemical free is clearly an advantage because chemicals do kill pollinators. And thankfully in Ontario, there's a ban on the cosmetic use of pesticides. Now, while it's not a pesticide, artificial fertilizers like Miracle-Gro should optimally be avoided. The salts in them disrupt the relationship between the mycorrhizal fungi, which lies just below the soil. And this is an organism that facilitates the movements of nutrients to and from plants and trees. And so these fertilizers, these artificial fertilizers, are likely adversely affecting other soil microbiota in addition to this relationship. And attracting beneficial insects instead of using chemicals to kill your so-called garden pests. The way you do this is by maximizing the diversity of plants that you can offer, because that will then attract more creatures that will take care of each other. Yeah. Okay. So be homey. You can allow some wild areas free of landscape fabric and mulch so that 70% of our native bees can nest in the ground. And if you can leave spent raspberry canes and other stems for the other 30% of our wild bees that are cavity dwellers, that would be great. If you can tolerate some leaf and brush piles, some fallen trees or branches or other deadwood, that is also really great habitat for bees. But if the wild look makes you uncomfortable, consider what the smart gardening folks from Michigan State University recommend: a mullet garden. So, following the characterization of this hairstyle, business in the front, party in the back, you may wish to allocate these untidy areas to your backyard where the pollinator party is happening. I'd also like to point out that if you're okay creating new social norms by making the front yard your pollinator paradise, signage is very useful. In case you weren't aware of it, Kitchener is a bee city, as is Waterloo, and Waterloo became the first bee region last year. A bee city means that our city council recognizes our dependence on that link between pollinators and plants and takes action by providing habitat for them. In particular, the city is encouraged to plant native perennials, which results in cost-saving measures, as native perennials don't need to be replaced annually. So to conclude, my main message for folks focused on solutions is that more native plant diversity means more native pollinator diversity. I'm hoping that this brief presentation helps you understand that hobby urban beekeeping, which refers to honeybees, is not a sustainable way to help save the bees. As much as your action is appreciated, it should be evident that every time we introduce a hive of, on average, 50,000 bees to a city where a habitat is in such short supply of limited quality, that action can have a negative effect on the local smorgasbord resources. So what you may not realize is that as a species, honeybees are not threatened with extinction, but a third of our bumblebees are. And there are now 8 bees officially listed at risk in Canada. The very best thing you can do for pollinators is share your space with them by establishing a diversity of native plants and places that they can nest. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kim. I'm all for the mullet garden look. Now to introduce our third and final speaker for the evening. Dan Borges is a honeybee research technician for the Ontario Beekeepers Association. He has a Master's of Science from the University of Guelph, where he studied the use of natural compounds and probiotics as a control for honeybee diseases. He is passionate about insects and also works part-time at Niagara College, where he teaches honeybee biology and entomology for horticulture. Dan keeps some hives of his own in the Kitchener area. Now Dan will present on why so stressed, modern beekeeping, and climate change. Please welcome Dan.
Thank you, Caitlin. Hello, everyone. So Kim and Kiera have given some great presentations on the importance of pollination and a lot of our pollinator species, with a big emphasis on our native pollinators and how incredibly important they are. So my talk is going to be focused a little bit more on honeybees and kind of their role and some of the stressors that they're facing. So to start off with, both Kim and Kiera have kind of touched on this. When it comes to pollination, honeybees really aren't the most efficient pollinators. They tend to start a little bit later in the day than our native pollinators. They like to sleep in a little bit more. And they require warmer temperatures to forage than most of our native bees do. So they're starting a little bit later and under kind of undesirable weather conditions. They're more likely to stay at home in their hive than they are to be out pollinated. In terms of the actual pollen loads that they bring back, the honeybees tend to actually bring back slightly smaller pollen loads than some of our native species. Not all of them, but some of them will bring larger pollen loads. And Kiera kind of talked about flower constancy. Honeybees are a little bit more lax on flower constancy than some of our native bees. So they're more likely to have a little bit of a mix of pollen, and they don't actually transfer as much pollen to other flowers as they're moving around as some of our native pollinators do. Another thing that was not touched on about why they're not the most efficient pollinators is that they don't do something called buzz pollination or sonication. So buzz pollination is very much what it sounds like. A bee will go to a flower to pollinate it, and she will buzz, basically. So her wing muscles are going to vibrate, and that actually dislodges some of the pollen grains better than if they're not vibrating like that. And so not not all native bees do this, but the ones that do it, they're a little bit better at pollinating, and there are some actual plant species that require buzz pollination to actually be pollinated, to actually dislodge that pollen. So honeybees don't do that. So they're not very efficient pollinators in comparison to a lot of our native bee species, but what they do have is numbers. That's what they have on their side. As both Kiera and Kim have touched on, they have very large colonies. So most of our native bees are solitary, so they'd just be a single bee doing the work, a single female. Some of our native bees do form colonies. So bumblebees, for example, do form colonies. But when we're talking about numbers in terms of a bumblebee colony, it's going to depend on the species of bumblebee, but usually anywhere from less than 100 individuals with some colonies to not usually a lot more than maybe 400 or 500. In comparison, a honeybee colony at its smallest point, so over the winter when they're kind of just clustering inside of the hive and they're not doing any work, will be about 10 to 20,000 bees. And then the peak of their population in the middle of the summer, a honeybee colony can be 75,000 bees or more. So they definitely have numbers on their side. So maybe not the most efficient pollinator, but that definitely really helps out. The other big reason that makes them important pollinators when we're talking about our crop and agricultural landscape is the fact that they're a managed species. So honeybees, like Kiera and Kim were mentioning, they're not native to North America, but they have been spread basically worldwide at this point. They are kept worldwide. And because they're managed and kept in a hive and they can be moved around, they are used for a very large percentage of our crop pollination. So they're considered the world's most economically important pollinator species. Again, not necessarily because they're the most efficient, but because of their numbers, because of the fact that they're managed. So I think Kiera brought up this number, but the Food and Agricultural Organization has estimated that the global value of the crops that require pollination to actually produce food is over $500 billion per year. And that isn't all done by honeybees by any means, but a very large percentage of it is. And again, that's what makes them such important pollinator species. So the fact that they're managed and that they're kept worldwide means that a grower can essentially have a type of guarantee, more or less, that their crop will be pollinated if they rent out beehives. So a lot of beekeepers, what they do is they rent out their hives to a grower. And there's a lot of research on, basically any plant that requires, or any crop that requires bee pollination, about something called the stocking rate. So basically, how many hives would you need per hectare or per orchard to ensure maximum fruit set or maximum yield. So because of that, a lot of beekeepers do what's called pollination services. And so that's kind of been brought up in a couple of the other presentations. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that actually means. What does it mean that a beekeeper is doing pollination services? So it's going to depend on what crop the beekeeper is actually pollinating, but generally their hives are going to be loaded up onto a truck. So it could be maybe less than 100 hives, depending if they're doing a smaller crop in the local area, to thousands of hives that can be loaded up onto these trucks. Those are going to be moved, transported. Again, it's going to depend where they're going, but up to thousands of kilometers to the site that they're going to be pollinating. And here in Ontario, a lot of colonies are transported out east to Quebec and to the Maritimes for blueberry and cranberry pollination. In the prairies, there's a lot of hive movement to pollinate canola for canola seed production. And in the States, for example, it's a kind of a whole different story. Colonies are moved from one end of the country to the other side of the country for pollination. Excuse me. So they might be moved to the West Coast for almond pollination, and then trucked all the way to the other side of the country for citrus pollination. So a lot of movement, depending on what the crops are that the bees are being transported for. In the process of these hives being moved from location to location, they're exposed to a lot of different agricultural chemicals. a lot of different pesticides and herbicides, and more than they would be exposed to in a normal situation if they were just stationary, because they're getting moved around. They're also exposed to a lot of different pests and diseases. So again, because they're being moved around into more than one location, but also because they could be at any of these sites intermingling with bees that are being brought from any other part of the country to do the same pollination. So they're exposed to quite a bit when they're trucked around. And then at their final destination, all of those hives will be dropped off. And usually they're dropped off in some sort of monoculture. So there's usually just a field of one type of plant, or there's an orchard of one type of tree that they're being dropped off to pollinate. So as you can imagine, everything that I've kind of listed there in terms of hives being managed for pollination is pretty stressful on the bees. And so managing hives for pollination does come with a lot of costs. So the bees are stressed out, and the stress lowers their immune system, so they're more likely to get sick, and they're less able to kind of fight off those diseases. They're also competing quite a bit when it comes to the resources that they're using to basically fuel their immune system on other processes in their body, like detoxification. So I mentioned that they're moving around and they're being exposed to a lot of agricultural chemicals. So the bee's body is working really hard to detoxify all of those chemicals. And that is resources and energy that isn't being spent on maintaining or sustaining the immune system and helping them fight off disease. I also mentioned that they're dropped off in what is generally a monoculture. So as you might imagine, a monoculture that has just one type of plant isn't generally very nutritionally sound, and it is at the very least not very nutritionally diverse. So a lot of the crops that bees are used for pollination might not have all of the required nutrients that a bee needs to actually produce offspring and grow its colony. But even if it does, again, it's just one source of food. So it's the same thing as eating the exact same kind of food day in, day out. So it does take a toll on their health. And one of the big impacts that it has is affecting their gut health. So both the feeding on a very nutritionally deficient food source, but also being exposed to all of those chemicals which are going inside of the bee. But it's a pretty big growing area of research in terms of the populations of microorganisms that live in our bodies and on our bodies. So not just in bees, but in other livestock and humans. But basically they play such an important role in keeping us healthy and keeping our immune system going. And so bees that have been exposed to these different agricultural chemicals, to very poor diets, we see this community of microorganisms in their gut. For one thing, it's usually declines, and there's less bacteria and less helpful organisms, but we can also just see a shift in general. So there's still many organisms in there, but they're no longer the helpful ones that we want in there to be keeping us healthy. So that the bees have this basically a pathogenic community of microorganisms in their gut that isn't making them very healthy. So the end result of all of this would be, or is very similar in bees as it would be to us. So if you're really stressed out and you're not really eating properly, we're going to get sick, and that's what happens with bees. So we see higher levels of certain pests and diseases in bees that are used for pollination services than we would see in populations of bees that are not used for these services. And also different types of pests and diseases that either we wouldn't see them at all, or even if we do see them, they're usually at very low levels that don't usually cause much of a problem in normal hives managed normally for honey production. So they make the bees sicker, and we see much higher levels of them, usually things that are associated more with stress and nutritional deficiency. So kind of the exact perfect storm of stressors that's happening during pollination management. And the overall impact that has on the colony at the colony level is that the bees are not really healthy enough and strong enough to grow their population to the level that they would need to bring in enough food to kind of survive for the year. So we have these small, weak colonies, and these results or these effects tend to persist even once the hives are brought back. So they're trucked out for pollination, and then they're brought back to wherever they started. And so we often see all of the effects that I mentioned above, those tend to persist even once they come back. And so those hives don't really get going and get on their feet. And so they tend to stay weak, and then they go into the winter weak, and often don't survive. So that's a pretty bleak picture of pollination services, and pretty stressful. The one benefit or pro about the situation, if you can think about it that way, is that most of the stressors involved in pollination management are at least known. And that's a big thing, because if we know what's causing the stress, we can direct research towards ways to solve that, to develop strategies, management strategies, to mitigate those results, and to try to basically reduce the impact on bee health as much as we can. So there's a lot of research on ways to kind of make the whole pollination management less stressful, from anything to how the bees are transported, and finding ways to make that less stressful. There's a lot of work that goes into supplemental feeding. So obviously you're feeding bees extra food and different types of food to help make up for the nutritional deficiencies that they might be facing when they end up in these monocultures that are really not very diverse and not very nutritionally sound. And then the last point there, there's also a lot of work and another kind of growing area of research into natural compounds and probiotics, not so much as a treatment for diseases, but usually as ways of boosting the immune system. So again, I mentioned that community of microorganisms that lives in the gut, and how incredibly crucial they are for immunity. Well, there's probiotics and natural compounds, that can be fed to bees, that can help not necessarily cure disease, but make the bee overall healthy and their immune system very robust, so that they can kind of deal with these diseases on their own. So everything that I'm mentioning here, all of this is really dependent on being able to identify those stressors. If you don't know what's causing the stress and causing the bees to be sick, it's kind of difficult to direct research and come up with management strategies to actually try to address that. And so one of the big unknowns that we have in terms of bee health, in terms of a lot of organisms on the planet, is climate change and the effects that it's going to have. So we know that lots of different organisms are already starting to feel the impact of climate change. And lots of scientists are really kind of scrambling with how that's going to play out in the future as climate change continues and potentially gets worse. So we do know that overall climate change is going to result in a warmer global temperature, but probably the more damaging one to a lot of organisms is that it's going to increase the frequency of extreme weather patterns. So really heavy rainfall that leads to flooding, as well as, and probably more likely, extreme heat and dryness that causes extended drought. So all of those are potential things that organisms are going to have to face as a result of climate change, and that most organisms are facing to a degree already right now. So there's still definitely a lot of unknowns with climate change in terms of how that's going to affect pollinator species in the future, but we do have some research about how at least some of those conditions that are going to be more frequent and more likely, how they're affecting bees and pollinators right now. So one thing is, during really hot and dry temperature, bees tend to forage a lot less. So they tend to stay in their hive when the weather isn't very favorable. So when it's too cold or when it's rainy, they'll stay in the hive or stay at their nest, because it's just too costly for them to kind of maintain their body temperature while going out and foraging. So the exact same thing happens basically with really hot, dry temperatures. So the bees will have to spend too much resources to be able to cool themselves so that their body doesn't shut down. And so they end up just staying in the hive. This also kind of a double whammy. It also affects the food on the other end as well. So the flowers and the plants that they would forage on. So really hot, dry temperature can cause plants to produce either less nectar or sometimes no nectar at all because it's too dry, which makes those plants unattractive to bees, so the bees will just avoid them. It also affects the pollen that is created. So again, under really hot, dry conditions, plants will produce less pollen, and the pollen that they produce is actually of poor quality, so lower nutrition value of the pollen that's created. And some of these effects can actually even be seen if we're seeing the opposite end of things, so really heavy rainfall. So there is research that shows really heavy rainfall can wash out pollen grains from a lot of different types of plants. Again, not necessarily making them unattractive, but it just means that when the bee goes there to get some pollen, it doesn't get any reward from it because it's been washed out. And it also has an impact on the nectar as well. So the heavy rainfall can dilute the nectar. So once again, it's more watery and it's less attractive to the bees. I think Kiera touched on this a little bit in her presentation about phenology, or that synchronization between plants and pollinators. And that's another thing that scientists are kind of wondering exactly what the impact is going to have on pollinators. So we know that climate change is going to impact a lot of different organisms, but the way that it impacts them, the degree that it impacts them, might be different between different types of organisms, different species. So the fear basically with this is that if hotter, drier temperatures or extreme rainfall happens to push plants in one direction, pollinators in a slightly different direction, you get all of a sudden this disruption between that synchronization that is so necessary for both the pollinator and the plant. So you could end up with plants that are blooming really early in the year when pollinator populations aren't available to actually pollinate them, or vice versa, pollinator populations kind of ramping up and getting ready to go, but there's nothing out there for them to feed on and nothing for them to sustain their populations with. So kind of all of that is going to cause a lot of the impacts that I mentioned before with stress. So basically the bees are out foraging for very short periods of time. They're not able to find food, and the food that they find isn't necessarily as good of quality food. And it's going to affect overall their health. So their immunity is lower, their gut health is lower, and they're more likely to get sick. Another big impact of climate change that has the potential to have a pretty profound impact is the movement of species. So both the actual species that we're interested in, like a pollinator species, as well as invasive species that could harm them. So with the bees themselves, with the fact that they're going to have to travel and migrate more distances to find food, they're more likely to be coming in contact with more pests and diseases, more members of their own species where they can pass those diseases on or contract them from other members of their species. But again, we can also see the same thing happen with pests and parasites and invasive species in particular. So a lot of them, or some of them anyways, their range can possibly have reached basically a border or a wall where they can't really get past, maybe because it's too cold if they go any further north. So as the global temperature warms up, those ranges are able to extend and expand, and we can see invasive species, invasive pests and parasites that start infesting bees and pollinators that wouldn't normally in the past. So an example in the bottom right there, that's a type of mite. It's called Tropolalaps. It's a mite species that is, at the moment, it's only found in Southeast Asia, and it affects honeybees there because in the tropical areas where they're found, the bees basically don't ever stop producing brood or producing offspring. So there's always offspring available, and these mites are extremely reliant on those offspring to be able to feed. They can't really survive more than about 7 days or so without those young larvae developing. So they can't actually feed on adult bees, and that's really something that's prevented them from spreading to other parts of the world, because here in a temperate region where we have winter, the bees actually stop producing offspring for almost the entire winter. So those mites wouldn't be able to survive. If we're dealing with climate change and kind of a gradual increase in the global temperature, we might get to situations where that break where the bees are stopping producing offspring is very short or possibly non-existent, which could allow mites like this to spread beyond their range that's currently only in Southeast Asia. So there's definitely a lot of unknown with climate change. This is kind of a lot of doom and gloom. So I don't want to leave you on a negative note here. So for the last couple minutes of my presentation, just going to introduce a project that the Ontario Beekeepers Association, so my team is collaborating on with some researchers around the country to work on, where the goal of the project is to kind of shed light on bee stress overall. So it's not necessarily directed at climate change in particular, but some of the stressors that bees are facing, maybe many of the stressors that bees are facing, at least have some relation to climate change. But so the project is called the BScI project for crime scene investigation. It's a Genome Canada project. The head researchers are Dr. Amro Zaid at York University and Dr. Leonard Foster at the University of British Columbia. And they're the head researchers for this project, but it's a national project, and they're collaborating with researchers all across the country. But the overall goal of the project is basically to sample a wide variety of honeybees and to look for very unique sets of markers or responses to a variety of different types of stressors. And so when I say markers or responses, we're talking about a genetic or a protein response. So for example, when a bee is exposed to poor nutrition, it has this response, or when it's exposed to a particular pesticide, it has this response, or a particular parasite or pathogen, it has this response. And the responses could be something like this gene is turned off, or this gene is turned on, or maybe a protein is produced or activated. But basically, they'd want to find a unique set of markers or responses that are associated with all of these different types of stress that a bee could be facing. And the hope would be that this can be used as a diagnostic tool in the future to help identify the causes of stress. So you could take a sample of some bees that are maybe not doing so well, but you're not sure what's causing that stress and the bee health issues. And then by analyzing that sample and the responses or the markers that you find, you can help identify what the factor is or the factors that are causing that stress. And that's important because, like I was mentioning before, the biggest step kind of is actually identifying what's causing that stress, because if we can identify what's causing it, we can direct research and we can develop strategies, management strategies to help mitigate the stress and to really prevent as much of the impact on bee health as we can. So it's an exciting project, and hopefully you'll hear more about it in the near future when we have more results to show. But I think that's a more positive note to end on than the doom and gloom of climate change. But thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Dan. That sounds like a really great project. I think we'll transition now to the question portion of the evening. We have a few questions from viewers right now. So the first question, and I suspected this one would come up just based on the news this week, is we have viewers that are curious to get everyone's take on the hype surrounding the murder hornets.
Maybe I'll field that one. I think a lot of the, other than the actual concern about human health and about being stung by these wasps, there's definitely a lot of concern in the beekeeping community because the wasps can target beehives. I think the current state, there have been some articles that have come out from beekeepers and bee researchers in BC about kind of how their take on the situation right now, and I'd say generally they're not overly concerned right now. So yes, these are pretty aggressive hornets, but there's very few in number, and the goal is to try to eradicate their populations this season. So right now, their kind of annual cycle, the queens will kind of just be emerging from hibernation and getting their colonies started. So they're going to still be in very small populations now, but people are kind of on the lookout for them, and they hopefully can trace them back to their nests, and they're trying to eradicate the nests, especially right now while they're pretty small. So there isn't a huge concern, but I won't say there's no concern. They're definitely, we don't want these wasps to kind of spread around the country. I think the concern with people with human health is definitely, I would say, the part that's maybe a little bit more overblown than what is necessary. Yes, they can be dangerous, and there are cases of them killing people in Asia where they're from. But with most wasps, they're not very aggressive when you kind of see them out on flowers or even really out hunting. They're really more of an issue if you happen to stumble upon one of their nests, and that's when they're going to get defensive. So this isn't something that, if you see it flying around, it's coming after you and trying to sting you. So hopefully there'll be more information about it when we get a little bit of a better idea of their numbers in BC, but I don't think it's a big concern at the moment anyway.
They're not here in Ontario. Is that right, Dan? And
No, yeah.
so, Dan, if people do see a large wasp or hornet, what might they be looking at?
So the only hornet that we have here, the only true hornet, is also an invasive species, but the European hornet is one that you would see around here, and I've definitely seen populations of them here. They're established in Ontario, and definitely can look very similar. So the coloration is kind of similar. Again, if you're looking at them side by side, they're not identical or anything, but they're pretty big. They're bigger than yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets that you'd see more commonly. But that's likely what you'd see if you're seeing here in Ontario. And it would be the same precautions, I guess, you take as with anything else, like a yellow jacket. I mean, they're not out there to hurt you, but if you're at their nest and you're harassing them, you might get stung.
Next question. Kim, maybe you might want to touch on this one. Someone asked, when is it safe to cut their stems in their garden? Don't think we can hear you. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. It's all good. Yeah, so, well, really, it would be when these bees have emerged in the spring, but it's tough to nail a time. Exactly. So, because you don't know exactly which species are occupying. I suppose you might be safe to do so. See, and the other complication is that then the bees will reproduce and start occupying the stems. So I don't really have a very good answer for you, actually. I prefer to not cut the stems. But I guess if people really want to, Heather Home does suggest cutting them back at least to 15 centimeters or so. If you can leave a stubble of 15 centimeters, probably, you know what, I can't pin down a date. I suspect Kiera or Dan could better pin down an exact time in the spring.
Can I just piggyback on that?
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right with all that hesitation because there are so many species that use those stems. So you're absolutely right that the correct response is don't cut them, but that if you're using the mullet approach, perhaps you can leave them long in your backyard if you feel like you need to clean them up in the front. And if you've cut them in the front, put them in the back for a while in case there's still something in there that can come out. But I think you're absolutely right that there are species that emerge right into July. There some with the second generation, and you're right. By that time, we might have new nesters that then are going to be in there over winter. So if they've laid eggs in there in July, and you cut it down because you think that you're safe, you're cutting down next year's population.
Thank you for that much more eloquent answer. It's been a long day.
You were right, though. Yeah, I agree.
Our next question is, through what process or mechanisms do European honeybees outcompete native bee pollinators, and to what degree / extent?
I could start on this, and then maybe Dan, you could give your opinion, unless Kim, you also have one. But I can only speak to the difficulty I've had in the literature when I've been trying to find studies that say that honeybees are outcompeting wild bees. And researchers are hesitant to use that term because we don't really know what those mechanisms are. Whether it's, the honeybees are not standing there guarding their resources that we've seen so far. It's more of an issue of just their sheer abundance is probably draining those resources before the wild bees can get there to access the nectar and pollen. So that's all I can say about it, because I don't think that anybody's shown a direct competitive interaction as of yet. But Dan or Kim, either one of you could be able to pick that up from there.
Sure. Sorry, Dan.
Nope.
Yeah, I think Tepedino and Kane have a paper out that talks about the resources that a honeybee would use compared to a native bee. I believe there is some evidence in there, but yes, I think the literature isn't clear cut. I think more research needs to be done, but I think it's prudent to proceed with the precautionary principle when it comes to making those comparisons, or not making those comparisons, but if you're considering having a honeybee hive in the city, let's say.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that what some of the research does show that is kind of an important takeaway from, especially from both of Kim and Kiera's presentations, where they're talking about the best things you can do to help pollinators. What the research shows is that the cases where honeybees are outcompeting and the population is switching from native bees to more honeybees, where that's most prevalent and most extreme is in cases where we're looking at monocultures or not very diverse situations. So it's actually a much smaller effect, definitely still an effect, but a much smaller effect when we're looking at more diverse habitats. So when there are more habitats for native pollinators, when there's a diversity of food, the impacts that a honeybee population has on native bees is a lot smaller. So there's really an important emphasis on the biggest thing you can do is really on trying to plant pollinator gardens and giving them that habitat, because that's really what's helping them. Because like Kiera was mentioning, there isn't really a lot of evidence that the honeybees are actively trying to get the other native bees away from them. It's more just the sheer amount the sheer amount of resources that they're using compared to the smaller native bee populations, basically.
I would like to add one other thing in that, although it can go both ways, that honeybees and other bees, of course, share resources. So they share flowers, and they can cross-contaminate this way. They can pass diseases to each other. And yeah, so again, there isn't clear evidence for it, but yeah, speculation.
Okay. I think the next two questions I have are somewhat related, but I could be wrong as I'm not an expert on bees. But Irene was asking, how do I move the hive from the barn to a bee box? The queen is hidden deep in the barn wood. We have tried to retrieve the queen in the past and we were unsuccessful. And another viewer asked, how do you decrease stress during transportation of bees?
Okay, I'll field that one. So definitely a big part of beekeepers, especially newer beekeepers, is kind of the excitement of catching swarms. So assuming that what you have in the barn is actually a honeybee colony and you wanted to move that, there's different ways of doing it. Like you can contact certain beekeepers that would actually maybe bring out like a vacuum of sorts that would be a little bit would get basically a larger amount of the bees that are in there. So if you want to make sure you get the queen, because that is like you're kind of mentioning there, that's an important thing. If you get all the other bees in the box, but the queen is still back in the barn there, they're not going to stay there. They'll just go back. So you do really need to get the queen. So it's a little bit easier when it's, when you see a swarm on a tree branch or something, and you can more easily shake that into a box. When it's in a wall or something like that, yeah, it can be definitely a lot more tricky for sure. In terms of the stress of moving bees, doing things like, it can be simple things like the time that you're moving bees. So it's usually best to be moving bees at night, essentially, or under poor weather conditions, because if you, at any time in the middle of the day when you go to move a hive, if it's good weather, a big chunk of the bees are out foraging. So it's pretty stressful on the bees if you were to pick up the hive then and try to transport them there, because they lose a big chunk of their of their population. And then there's a lot of work and a lot of resources that go into all of a sudden trying to replace a huge percentage of the population that just went missing. So moving it under the right circumstances, probably making sure that they have enough feed. So if they're going to be screened in and moved, but they don't have any resources, they don't have any honey stores in the hive itself, they can starve to death. So different things like that. A lot of hives are given pollen patties or pollen supplements during transportation. Those are things you don't want to have in the hive when they actually get to the location, because you want them to be going out and getting pollen. But before and during the transportation, having those extra resources, especially the fats and proteins, kind of helps them to be able to maintain their immune system and maintain their population. So those are some of the ways you can try to keep bees happy in what is a situation that they're probably not very happy in.
Great. Another question is, would it be a good strategy for crop pollination to plant the right native perennials nearby to attract native bees, rather than trucking European honeybees all over?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, bringing back hedgerows would really help with a lot of diversity. And I believe that there are studies that do show that hedgerows can increase productivity for crops. Yeah, perhaps somebody else has more to add.
I would add moving away from pollinators, but I mean, adding those hedgerows and increasing that is also helpful for things like integrated pest management of a lot of crops too, because it's not just the pollinators that it's bringing, but it brings a pretty wide variety of other insects and other organisms that are really crucial to controlling a lot of the pests that really can get out of control when you have, just a monoculture of one crop with no diversity around it. I mean, that's the perfect buffet for something that feeds on that crop. So that's why a lot of these pest populations get out of control. So definitely increasing the diversity of plants in and around fields is not just helping pollinators, but it's helping the farmers and the growers in the long end as well, by reducing costs that they would normally have to put into different forms of pest management.
And I would just add a final note that the Xerxes Society is an excellent resource for implementing hedgerows and pollinator garden areas around crops. That's XERCES. If whoever posed that question or other listeners are interested in further resources on that topic.
That's great. Another question we have is, what is your thinking on bee houses?
Okay, I'll go for this. I think your time can be spent better doing other things. The bee houses are very species specific. So the diameter of the hole that you are providing for them is species specific based on their body size. You also want to, there has been one study out there, I'm not sure that in nature that this happens, but the idea is that if your bee house isn't long enough, you can skew the sex ratio. So I didn't elaborate. If you can recall the cross section of the cavity dweller that I was showing, in that there are usually 10 to 12 cells of bees developing. If it's shorter, so the method that the female bee uses is that she goes into the cell, she lays female eggs first, and then she'll lay a few male eggs, and then she'll have a few empty cells. And this is to foil predators in case they peek in looking for food. But if you're shorter, then you can skew that sex ratio, which affects the population. And then also the other thing about the bee houses is that they need some, they can be affected by mold and other sort of diseases. And so they need to be kept clean if you want to continue to use them. Yeah, I just think it's better that nature just takes care of things and you can go relax in the backyard and just enjoy it.
Yeah, I totally agree. If I can just jump in there too. And remember, 70% of the wild bees nest in the ground. So,
Mhm.
you're helping a few species out by providing some above ground nesting that they could probably find elsewhere. The literature is just pretty vague right now about whether we're doing more damage than good by providing those, because we don't know what kind of disease propagation we're promoting by providing things that aren't really natural to them.
And in such a high concentration that might not necessarily happen in the wild, because you get a bee box filled with those tubes, and so they're all next to each other, and that wouldn't necessarily be the way they would nest in the wild.
Right.
And studies have shown as well, especially Scott McIver from the University, is he at York or Toronto? Toronto, that after 3 years, it's generally not bees that are occupying these sorts of things. It's usually invasive wasps in general. And not that wasps are bad, they're not. Every creature has a purpose, and wasps especially, they will, as I mentioned earlier, they will help control your garden pests. And they're also pollinators in their own little way as well. So, but if you were trying to help bees, if that was the intention, then these bee houses may not be providing that objective. Yeah, and in fact, actually, I recall seeing many of these people will send me photos, and they'll have them mounted on a garage, and really they become food for birds in the autumn. So, yeah.
So that leads to our next question. Catherine is wondering, I would really like to provide habitat for bees in my yard, but I don't appreciate the nastiness of wasps without any provocation. Any ideas on how to deal with nasty wasps?
Just being aware of where they are is your best defense, because they're simply defending their home. So if you're getting too close to them, they will let you know. Otherwise, I mean, there is no other alternative except to kill them somehow. So yeah, I'm not sure about any other suggestions.
I know you can buy the kind of the little paper fake hives that are supposed to help a little bit as a competition thing, so that the wasps, like yellow jackets, for example, won't make a nest if they're too close to them. I mean, if you're considering maybe using chemicals and eradicating them, it's a better bet and possibly a safer bet. The important thing you would have to get that out early enough, because so the colonies won't survive over the winter, so they kind of die off, and then the mated queens will overwinter, and then they're going to start new colonies pretty early in the spring. So if you're trying to, if that does work, if the competition thing does work, those would have to be up early enough in the spring. That's when it would have its effect. Not sure how effective they are. I know that if a queen were to find an old nest, it's probably going to go with it regardless of whether there's one of those paper things hanging, because it's a lot less resources that she has to put into building a nest. But yeah, I think I would echo the sentiments that the best thing is to try to just be aware of them and avoid them, because they're not really going to be nasty unless you're near their nest, and they're important as control for a lot of pests and other insects. So ideally, I wouldn't recommend killing them.
So we have one last question. I think gardens are on a lot of people's mind right now as they are at home. And the last question is, are dandelions good for bees? I let them take over my yard.
I would say they're better for bees than nothing. So if you can leave them, then they're definitely providing good pollen. And I'm not sure what the nectar concentration is in dandelions, but if you can handle them, then I'm all for leaving things. It would also be good to increase the biodiversity in that area by planting some other species there too. But they are providing bee food. Anyone else?
Yeah, they're definitely a big nectar producer. With beekeeping, that's one of the things that beekeepers are waiting for is dandelion blooming, because really any time before that there is nectar out there to a small extent, and there's definitely pollen. So a lot of hardwood trees will be producing flowers and pollen earlier, but a honeybee hive is kind of trying to subsist on the honey stores that it made the previous year, and this is at this time of the spring is really when those are dwindling at the most. So you can have hives that starve. They've made it through the winter, but they starve, now or in the around this time of year, just because they run out of food. So really, when dandelions bloom, it's one of the big safety nets of sorts that they've made it, and they should have enough nectar coming in for the most part at this point to keep going.
Dan, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
My understanding is that dandelions, in fact, were imported along with the honeybees. They provide a very important amino acid to the honeybees. Is that correct?
The pollen. So it might be that they have a more complete amino acid profile than most other pollens. So there's 10 essential amino acids that bees need from pollen, and there is a lot of pollen that's deficient in one or two of those. So I think dandelion is a little bit more complete. But I should point out, so dandelion was the species that we see everywhere is for the most part an introduced species, but dandelions are we do have species that are native to here, so they're not all invasive anyway.
Great. So I think that will conclude our presentation for this evening. Thank you again for everyone that joined us this evening, and thank you again to our speakers for sharing your expertise and answering the public's questions. I know there was a couple comments regarding the sound cutting in and out. A clean copy of this presentation will be shared on both the museum's Facebook page and our YouTube channel with clean audio. And whether this was your first experience with the museum or you are one of our regular supporters, we thank you for your support and we can't wait to welcome you back into the museum once again. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Nice to see you, Kim. Nice to see you, Dan.